Right, so let's start with a big story that we are tracking this morning, where Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has secured a resounding mandate in the general elections, according to the exit polls. Now, after his resounding victory, Abe has said that he will firmly deal with threats from North Korea. The local media has said that Abe's Liberal Democratic Party-led coalition has won 312 seats, thus allowing it to retain its two-thirds supermajority within the Japanese parliament. Now, the win will bolster his ambition to revise Japan's post-war pacifist constitution. Now, it also means that his Abenomics growth strategy centered on hyper-easy monetary policy will continue in Japan.
今回ですね、私たちは北朝鮮の脅威にいかに対応していくか、いかに国民を守り抜くのか、そして少子高齢化をいかに乗り越えて子どもたちと日本の未来を切り裂いていくのかということについて集中的にお話をさせていただきました。つまり私は我々に対してまだ厳しい目線が注がれているということをですね、改めて認識をしたところでございますが。
Now, the leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, an opposition party in Japan, has also reacted to Abe's win. Let's listen in to that reaction as well.
私の想像以上に多くの国民の皆さんがこれまでの政治というものの全体に、国民から遠いと自分たちからかけ離れたところで、何かやっているというそういう意識を強く持たれていたんではないかと。いうことを痛感をいたしています。特に現状民進党がどうされるのかということが、おそらく一種の現在進行形なんだと思いますし、そこから遠離れて作った我々の立場から考えると、少なくともその状況がどうなるのかということが結論出るまでは、そことは対しては見守りたい。
神奈川15区
Well, so this is a historic election in more ways than one. This is, in a way, a breakaway from the past for Japan. This was a snap poll that was called in by Shinzo Abe and will have long-term ramifications in terms of how Japan will proceed from here. Because the fundamental and key aspect which Shinzo Abe is, of course, aiming for is to bring about changes in the pacifist constitution of Japan. And to discuss as to what exactly will be the consequences of this and what does this resounding victory mean for Shinzo Abe, I am joined in by a panel of guests. In the studio, I'm joined in by our senior international affairs editor, Padma Rao. And I'm also joined in by Professor Jeffrey Kingston, who's a specialist in Asian affairs at Temple University in Tokyo. And I'm also joined by Professor James D.J. Brown, who is also an international affairs expert. So let me start with you, Professor Jeffrey Kingston. You know, this is a big victory for Abe. He was essentially taking a gamble. He's called in for a snap poll, and he's likely to come with a resounding majority back into the Japanese parliament.
Yes, I think he'll feel vindicated that he made the right call. Certainly benefited from the fact that the opposition was divided, and so every time the opposition is divided, it makes it a lot easier for the LDP to romp to victory. But there was a note of caution there. The ruling coalition lost a dozen seats. Right. And the main liberal opposition party has actually more than trebled its number of seats. So it's not exactly a huge landslide. It is the LDP basically did as expected. So it was an anticlimactic victory and a little bit less than they had before.
An anticlimactic victory, a little bit less than what they had before. And let me come to you, Professor James Brown. You, of course, have been following this election very closely. You know, this is an election which a lot of people are saying is a break away from the past. It is essentially to bring about a change in the constitution that Shinzo Abe went in for these snap polls. It is to get a mandate for that he has actually called these polls, and he now stands vindicated.
Well, that's right, and I very much agree with the comments just made by my colleague there. In many ways, this is a success for Prime Minister Abe. It could have all gone wrong, and indeed, a few weeks ago, it looked like it was going wrong. You had the formation of the new opposition party, the Party of Hope. For a time, there was a great deal of momentum with that party. That faded away, and the LDP were actually able to do really quite well. But I agree with the assessment that we shouldn't get carried away with the idea that this indicates that the LDP and Prime Minister Abe are enormously important. They benefited rather from divisions within the opposition, and also, I think, concerns to do with the North Korean crisis. Right. We can also look at the turnout at this election. It was only around 53%. It's one of the lowest turnouts in Japanese elections, and that also indicates that there isn't a huge amount of enthusiasm for the LDP.
Right, you're indicating the turnout is something which is very important, not huge enthusiasm for the LDP. Let me bring in Padma Rao here. Now, Padma, one of the key fundamental issues with which Shinzo Abe has gone into this election is Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which says that Japan cannot have a military, which has been interpreted slightly differently within Japan, where they've said we can have an armed force so long as it is only for defensive purposes. Now, with the North Korean crisis, turning out as to what it is that what has pushed Shinzo Abe for this?
Yes, most certainly. That is the immediate threat. There were missiles being flown over Japan, and there have been repeated noises emanating from North Korea. And I think there is also a large amount of support because the Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution was essentially authored by the Americans themselves. And I think Prime Minister Shinzo Abe certainly has the Americans on his side. President Donald Trump, who will be visiting Japan early November, as far as the question of North Korea is concerned. So he is likely to find much international support in, let's say, rephrasing that clause, because there is, some people would just merely like to have it reworded in Japan. Others, want a drastically changed Article 9 in that constitution. Whichever way it plays out, it is almost certain that that will be one of the top priorities of Shinzo Abe's new-old government, so to speak.
Absolutely, indeed. And Professor Jeffrey Kingston, if I could bring you in on this, how critical do you think is the issue of North Korea dominating within Japan's politics here?
Missile testing rescued Abe. In August, he was reeling. He had gone from 60% approval in the polls earlier in the year to 26%. That was largely due to two cronyism scandals and a defense minister cover-up scandal. So the people really turned on him. But ever since the missile test, there's been a rally around the flag tendency in the public. And on security issues, the LDP has a lock. And so this really benefited Abe. But Abe said he called the snap election to get a mandate for his hard line on North Korea. And in fact, almost half the people in an NHK poll just a few days ago said they don't agree with the prime minister. I think they think he's shortchanging diplomacy and negotiations. So he didn't get that mandate that he sought.
He did not get the mandate that he sought, but the fact of the matter is, probably the politics of North Korea has of course, helped Abe save face in this. But how important do you think have been these scandals? Professor James Brown, if I could come to you on this, in terms of, Abe was battling these scandals of cronyism. He was also said to be arrogant, getting arrogant within the Japanese circles of politics. So how significant do you think this mandate will be for Abe to push forth with his agenda of bringing about a change in the constitution?
Well, it's widely believed that, in fact, these scandals were a factor why the Prime Minister decided to call the election when he did. That if he hadn't moved to dissolve the Parliament and have these early elections, in the new parliamentary session, one of the main points of focus was going to be to continue to question the Prime Minister on these scandals. So in a way, by calling this early election and getting a good result, he will hope to have put these scandals behind him. And indeed, you can see in the initial comments made by Abe after this election that he is trying to take a more humble stance. There seems to be a recognition that the Japanese public have come to see him as somewhat arrogant, And I think under this new administration, after this election, there will be an attempt to try and take a less arrogant, a more humble approach. The key question will be whether there are any additional scandals forthcoming.
Any additional scandals forthcoming? Padma, if I could bring you in on this, the challenge for Abe was, of course, from the governor of Tokyo, Yuriko Kaiko, who was immensely popular till about a few months back. And now Abe is back. Essentially, he's got the mandate that he sought for. Maybe it's not the mandate that he had hoped for, but he still is the man in the driver's seat there.
Well, I think what Prime Minister Abe has certainly shown by calling the snap election is, since you refer to Ms. Yuriko Koike of the Party of Hope, if you recollect last year, Saleh, there was a point in time when she, just after her party had won, or when she had won the municipal election, her popularity was on the upswing. And I think what Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has effectively done by calling a snap election is to curtail that popularity before it ran away altogether. Had he allowed another year to pass by for the elections to take place as they were originally scheduled, there is the danger perhaps that her party would have swelled in popularity and gained in strength, and it would have been a much tougher contest. So I think one of the things that Prime Minister Abe has proven himself to be by calling the snap election is knowing how to potentially get opponents out of the way who might be potential dangers.
That's an important point that you raise here. Abe, by calling this election, has played himself as a shrewd politician. He's used the crisis in North Korea, and that is what has bolstered his image, Padma.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you look at it, this party, it started off, it had a lot of enthusiastic support from voters, the Party of Hope. But sooner or later, it people began to lose interest. And rightfully, as one of our guests pointed out, overall, the voter turnout may not have just been the storm or the typhoon that is threatening the Japanese coast. It was also a lack of enthusiasm because, yes, they have seen Mr. Abe and his brand of Abenomics, and, they pretty much know what his agenda is. So I think that was one of but the other reason that the turnout may have been low is a disillusionment because there wasn't really much available by way of choice because, as I said, Ms. Koike's party, which showed great promise, somehow frittered out, and I think it took a beating even when especially when she said that she's not herself running for the lower house. Absolutely, indeed. And Professor Jeffrey Kingston, how much do you agree with that? What Shinzo Abe has essentially done is he's stopped the swell of support for Koike's party, which was swelling in terms of its popularity. By calling these snap polls, what he's effectively done is he's tried to put a full stop to this rise in terms of popularity of Mayor Kaiko there.
Well, now we know it was astute timing. He caught the opposition parties totally unprepared. And Koike made a couple of bad mistakes. The first, as the other presenter said, was regarding not running in the election herself. I mean, she positioned herself as this rabble-rousing populist taking on the powers that be, but she wasn't really ready to risk it by running herself. The second big problem was her mismanagement of the merger with the Democratic Party, which had been the largest opposition party and disbanded when the snap elections were called. She then decided to vet the renegades from that party to decide whether or not they agree with her policies. That was okay, but then she forced them to sign loyalty pledges. She got pilloried in the media for being so dictatorial and authoritarian. So I think she understands that she blew it for her party. The key problem facing Abe going forward is that Abenomics is not benefiting most people. Polls show that nearly 3/4 of Japanese are not feeling the love. Abenomics is often derided as welfare for the wealthy. Right. Under Abe, household income, inflation adjusted, has actually declined. Wages are flat. Bonuses are down. So that is going to be a vulnerable issue for him since he makes such a big deal about Abenomics. And he's done nothing in terms of structural reforms. So he's got a lot of work ahead of him.
Absolutely. We'll discuss more on that, Professor Jeffrey Kingston. Meanwhile, Padma has a question. Go ahead, Padma.
Yes, I'd like to ask Professor Brown, or indeed Mr. Kingston, about Ms. Yuriko Koike. You know, this party, there was, she has run on the plank of popular policies like an exit from nuclear power and a freeze on the planned sales tax rise. Now, would you say, Professor Brown, that those people are actually tired of listening to, you know, that kind of rhetoric? Are these subjects that are no longer, you know, the hot subjects of any election? Is it perhaps, you know, was that her choice of subjects for her plank or election plank? Do you think it might have been, you know, the wrong choice, given that Japan is, you know, the constitution was written 70 years ago, and people may not be that interested anymore in exiting nuclear power, or you know, or not having a military, for instance?
No, I think those issues of nuclear and the tax rise remain very, very important. And indeed, in that regard, the Party of Hope were quite kind of accurate in focusing on that, because those are policies of the LDP which are not popular with the rest of the population. The problem with the Party of Hope was not selecting to focus on those issues. It was rather that they were a vehicle. It's a party which is a vehicle for the political interests of Governor Koike, and yet she decided not to run. Therefore, you had a party which was standing for the election, and yet there was no clarity about who would actually be the Prime Minister if that party actually won. I think that's where everything really started to go wrong for the Party of Hope, rather than focusing on nuclear or the tax rise.
Well, you know, just to follow up on that, perhaps I could ask Professor Kingston or Mr. Kingston, if that is the case, if, you know, issues like nuclear power and the sales tax rise, if these are not the key issues, or rather they are, you know, that they sort of people haven't turned away from them. If that is the case, Mr. Kingston, why did how difficult is it going to be for Prime Minister Abe to push through reforms to, for instance, the Article 9 of the Constitution and other things which, you know, radically sort of go to the roots of what the Japanese have been ruled by way of Constitution since the end of World War II?
Well, I think, you know, James is right that the public opposes restarting Japan's idled nuclear reactors overwhelmingly. Koike had no credibility on the issue because she's been pro-nuclear most of her political career, and suddenly for the elections she comes out against it. So I don't think it's really fair to say, you know, support for her is a barometer for public attitudes towards nuclear energy. Polls show consistently Japanese people are against it. Going forward in terms of constitutional revision, this morning NHK reported that out of the 465 Diet members, 371 are pro-constitutional revision. So clearly the political center in Japan has shifted to the right, and this has put wind into Abe's sails. The reason he's got into politics is to revise the Constitution and to rewrite Japan's wartime history. It looks like it's within his grasp. The problem is the devil in the details. Getting everybody to agree on what to revise and how to revise it will be divisive. But assuming that he does push it through 2/3 in upper and lower house, he then needs a simple majority. Right now, a majority of Japanese are opposed to constitutional revision, but for the Prime Minister, that's just a challenge to take on. And they're going to mount a full-court PR press to convince people of the necessity of doing so, and Kim Jong-un is helping him a great deal.
Absolutely, indeed. And also, Padma, you know, let me ask you this question. The world over, across Europe and even America, we're seeing a clear tilt to the right in terms of how politics is moving. How do you read this verdict which has been given, this mandate which has been given to Shinzo Abe?
Yes, indeed. I mean, we just saw an election on the 24th of September in Germany, which was the other, country that was defeated after World War II. And it had a similar constitution. It has similar constitutional sensibilities. The Germans are very, very, were very touchy about nuclear energy, were very touchy about several issues that were close to their hearts, very sensitive subjects. But there has been a rise of, or rather rather a tilt towards the right wing, as you pointed out, even in Europe and certainly in France and in many other countries. Now, of course, the reasons and the causes in Europe lie elsewhere, perhaps, than in Japan. But I think it's just interesting to see that overall, you know, just touching sensitive issues like nuclear power or, or reworking the Japanese constitution, these are no longer such touchy subjects, neither in Japan nor in many other parts of the world.
Absolutely, indeed. Do stay on with us. So Shinzo Abe's victory is expected to, of course, see him turn his attention to the two key issues. One, of course, is North Korea, and the other is the slow-growing economy, a product of steadily aging society. But there seems to be little doubt that voter insecurity about North Korea's saber-rattling and missile testing has led them to repose their trust in Abe. The Prime Minister has kept a tough line on North Korea, vowing that he will not be intimidated by Pyongyang and that he will, in concert with the United States, step up the pressure on the North. Now, exactly what he intends to do or has in mind is still not clear, but there could be some clarity when President Trump arrives in Tokyo next month. For now, the focus, of course, turns to Abe's plans to amend the constitution, which after its defeat in World War II required it to renounce war. Now, Japan's defense military, since then, Japan has built up an impressive armed force. For constitutional reason, it has called it a self-defense force rather than as the Japanese army. The last year's defense budget was about $46 billion, and that figure is expected to rise given the North Korean threat. And also China's rising military profile around Japan's periphery is also something which Shinzo Abe would be looking at very, very closely. Now, the constitutional amendment will allow the military to be sent overseas to work closely with its US and other allies in terms of defense of national and regional interests. But this will of course take time and will involve a referendum. And there's speculation that Abe's victory could see Japan embrace the nuclear option as well. This is of course a very controversial move. It remains to be seen as to how Shinzo Abe proceeds in terms of this. Now, what this would of course mean is that it will develop or acquire nuclear weapons to counter North Korea and China. And important to note here is that Abe is a nationalist who sees China as a threat. Now, countering China, he will of course move to offset China's growing strength in Asia, Africa and elsewhere. And he'll work with the United States to counter China in the East and also in South China Seas. He may offer alternatives to China's Belt and Road initiatives. He will not compromise on Japan's hold over the Senkaku Islands, which China disputes as its own. But he will also cooperate with China. Both countries currently do around $400 billion in terms of bilateral trade, and a growing China means opportunities for Japan. As the US trade policy becomes more protectionist, they are expected to push for greater integration into Asia, perhaps a mega Asian free trade area. So it will be reasonable to expect an Abe-Xi Jinping summit before long. So these of course are the challenges. These of course are the possible scenarios with which Shinzo Abe is having to contend with. But Professor Jeffrey Kingston, if I could bring you back on this. You spoke about how Abenomics. Right, we seem to have lost Professor Jeffrey Kingston. We'll try reconnect with him. But let me take that question to the other guest that we've got, Professor James Brown. Now, Professor Brown, one of the things which is being talked about is Abenomics. Japan is going through doldrums. The economy is flat. And, what Abe has done is he's gone ahead with this very capitalistic approach where he's made credit easier for people to get credit and thereby start their businesses. But this, of course, has helped the rich and not the common Japanese people. How do you see this playing out, in the years going forward? He's, of course, got a mandate now where he can stay till 2021. But how much of an impact will, the failed Abenomics will have within the politics in Japan?
Well, from the government's point of view, they would clearly contest the characterization of Abenomics as failed. They've been somewhat disappointed that it's taken rather a long time for results to be seen, but they say that it is working, but just very slowly. So what they'll say now is that we plan to continue with the policy. They will almost certainly reappoint the current head of the Bank of Japan. and hope that given this extra time, Abenomics will actually kind of see results. The alternative narrative about this is that actually Abenomics will not work even if it has additional time. And the evidence of that is that despite all of the efforts at stimulus, wage rises and inflation, which are some of the main goals of Abenomics, have not seen any improvements. We have a continued drop in the rate of unemployment in Japan. You would expect that would kick on into wage increases. So far, we haven't seen it. And so as a result, many ordinary Japanese really haven't seen the benefits of Abenomics.
The ordinary Japanese haven't seen the benefits of Abenomics. How much of a factor do you think this is, Padma, locally? Because he's talking about North Korea. This is the plank that he's actually virtually gone into the snap polls for. But in the long terms, if he's not able to, correct the problems within the Japanese economy, which is, let's put it this way, an aging population, how far will he be impacted? Will he even be able to complete his term? Because some people are saying, although he's come back with a big resounding margin, 2020 is still a far time off for Shinzo Abe.
Well, I certainly agree with Professor Brown. I think Abenomics has been, so far it's been a lot of talk and not no action or very little action on the ground. But, coming back to what you said a little while ago about competing with China, especially within Asia, as you know, India-Japan relations are very closer than ever before.
Yep.
And there have been, pretty substantial deals between the two countries. I think one of the problems, from what I understand of Abenomics, is that the Japanese exports are down because there isn't because they're just too the prices of their goods are too high. So one of the things that of the three arrows that Abenomics is all about, one of the arrows points at pumping more money or directing the central bank to pump more money into the market so that people stop saving and start spending instead. And the more they spend, the whole old question of demand and supply. So these are things, as Professor Brown pointed out, that have been talked about for a very long time, but possibly very little has been done on the ground. And that is the frustration that saw a lower turnout, for instance, at the election yesterday. But we certainly hope, I think, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe might be wiser this time, because, as you say, he has been given a reprieve, so to speak, and he certainly wouldn't want to lose the opportunity of going down in the history of Japan as the longest-serving Prime Minister, among other things.
Absolutely. So this is the fourth term that he's actually won. It's a resounding majority, although not the sort of majority that he had hoped for. Professor Brown, if I could bring you in on this. Japan has always had very close ties with the United States immediately in the aftermath of the Second World War. But now with Japan, pushing forth with wanting to amend the Constitution, amend Article 9, which was something which was virtually authored by the Americans, is this to impact the Japanese-US relationship at all if Japan were to take the nuclear route? Or do you think, even if Japan were to become a nuclear power, this will have no impact on the US-Japan relations?
Well, I think it's really premature to speak about Japan becoming a nuclear weapons state. Yes, there are stirrings of debate about this, but for the vast majority of the Japanese population, they consider this an abhorrent idea. So I think that we can talk about a gradual move towards Japan becoming a much stronger and more active military power, but I think it's probably still too early to talk about Japan becoming a nuclear weapons state. As to the relationship with the United States, it's somewhat mixed. In general, the United States is very much in favor of Japan becoming a more powerful and militarily active country because, since it's a major ally of the United States, if Japan can do more, that means that the US has a more capable ally. At the same time, however, Japan's ultimate goal is in part to prepare for a time when perhaps it will rely less on the United States. And that's where relationships with other countries, including with India, come in. Because in the future, Japan is worried that perhaps the United States will not always be willing or able to be so committed to security in East Asia. Therefore, Japan needs to have alternative security partners.
It needs to have alternative security partners. Interesting points there. We'll probe a bit more on that issue. Meanwhile, Padma, you had a question.
Yes, Professor Brown, I have a question for you. It's interesting to hear you talk about how reluctant the Japanese are to become a full-fledged nuclear weapons state. Now, my question to you is, is that attitude likely to change? Are those equations likely to shift as the threat from North Korea grows? And, one certainly hope it won't, but if it goes that way, and if, there are increasing missile strikes or missiles just being flown over Japanese territory, or any sort of, even if it's just noise, so to speak, just words coming out of Pyongyang, is that attitude and the consciousness within Japanese society likely to change as far as nuclear weapons are concerned?
Well, the threat from North Korea has led to a change in attitude, I think, towards constitutional revision. However, I don't think it's been sufficient a threat to actually change Japan's very firmly entrenched opposition to nuclear weapons. So for that actually to occur, it would have to be something a lot more dramatic. If the United States were suddenly in some way to undermine, to break its security commitments to Japan, that might be enough to lead the public to change their minds. If there was an attack on Japanese-administered territory, that might also lead to a change. But just the rhetoric and the threats from North Korea, I don't think is enough to push the Japanese public towards accepting nuclear weapons.
Absolutely, indeed. That is, of course, an important point here. And also, Professor Jeffrey Kingston, okay, I'm told we still do not have Professor Jeffrey Kingston. We'll try and get him back. But, Padma, one of the big issues that, a lot of people will, of course, be talking about at this point of time is this reassessment by Japan in terms of its military ambitions. The fact that Donald Trump is in power in the White House, and he's talking increasingly of, not very convinced about NATO. He says that the United States is giving way too much for other countries' security. Is that something which is playing on the back of the minds of the Japanese, where they're thinking, look, we have the backing of the Americans now, but going forward in future, that may not always be a reliable option that we can, fall back upon, and it would be important that to defend ourselves against the North Koreans, that we ourselves have a strong military. Is that one of those pushing factors which is making Japan reassess Article 9 in their constitution?
Yes, I certainly agree with Professor Brown on that point. I think these are, shifting sands all over the world. I don't think Japan is going to be, is not inclined to staying with the one ally or another. Indeed, we're seeing the forging of new alliances and new equations all over the world. Mm-hmm. I mean, who would have thought at one stage that the Iron Curtain would come crashing down? But then if you see, the shifting sands have now shifted in such a way that there are new Iron Curtains rising so these are, the traditional alliances are no longer hold good. This is one of the reasons why Japan and China, Japan and India have come much closer than ever envisaged before. At the same time, there are various countries that are being seen as mutual competitors. Let's say there's China and there's also North Korea in terms of, military clout or in terms of a threat. So there are mutual enemies and mutual friends, but those mutual enemies and mutual friends are no longer the same as they were, let's say, 50 years ago, 70 years ago. And indeed, I think that is one of the reasons why we're seeing the kinds of changes we are in countries like Germany and Japan, that, when constitutions were written after the Second World War, both in Germany and in Japan, they were very different countries. 70 years have gone by, much water has flown under the bridge. So I think there is a need, an innate need, or the feeling amongst many people, and that is possibly why Prime Minister Abe has this majority, he and his coalition, that there is a need to sort of reinvent or rewrite themselves, so to speak.
Reinvent after the Second World War. An interesting point that you've made there, Padma. And also, James Brown, if I could bring you in on this, with this mandate that, Shinzo Abe has got, do you think he'll pursue more aggressive foreign policy initiatives? Will we see it competing more aggressively with China, so to speak, in the region, both in terms of economy and also in terms of, reasserting in areas such as the South China Sea and also on the dispute over the Senkaku Islands?
I think aggressive is maybe not the right word. Assertive is certainly what his foreign policy will be. We will see a continuation of the efforts he's already made. He has spoken in the past about wanting to ensure that Japan remains a first-tier country internationally, and in his view, that requires Japan to be more assertive and active internationally and militarily. So that will involve more activities for the Japanese military in the vicinity of Japan, further afield as well, making use of the new interpretation of the Constitution to permit collective self-defense. We'll also see him very active internationally, trying to build partnerships with other countries. So that will include countries in Southeast Asia. It will include with Australia, certainly with India, and to an extent also with Russia too. So I think it's more of the same, really. As to competition, yes,
more of the same, but a reassertive Japan is how you've put it. In Padma, last words to you, help us make a sense of how Shinzo Abe will be going forward. Will we see a more militarily assertive Japan in the region there?
Well, I think he has a new lease of life, and I agree with Professor Brown. It's really going to depend on what he makes of it. Is he going to blow the chance away, or is he going to grab it and go down in history, not only as the longest serving, but as one of the most effective prime ministers of Japan? That remains to be seen. And I somehow have a feeling that, he is not going to lose this opportunity.
He's not going to lose this opportunity. Well, thank you very much indeed to Padma Rao, and also to the guests who joined us, Professor James Brown and to Jeffrey Kingston. So this, of course, is an important moment in Japan's politics. Shinzo Abe has got the mandate that he had, of course, hoped for. He's won the snap polls resoundingly. 2/3 majority is what he's got. But I would say it's not as complete a victory that he had hoped for. This, of course, is an election which will have a lot of ramifications within the region for Japan.